pregnant with me. And then they found out that my father was black. And they weren't very excited about that either. And the worst part for them, though, came was 6 months after I was born. My mom was killed in a horrific accident by a driver under the influence. And my father never quite recovered from that incident. He became pretty depressed. He certainly wasn't able to take care of me by himself. And when my grandmother, Madeline, my mother's mother, came from Canada, when all this was happening, and she picked me up for the first time. And apparently I'd been crying for 3 days after my mom had died. And so she picked me up, put me on her shoulder, and I instantly fell asleep. And my dad was like, "Can you just take her for a little bit back to Canada until I can figure out what's going on with my life?" And so they agreed. And so it seems then, from the start, I really didn't have a very traditional family setup, and moved to Canada with my grandparents, Madeline and Ron. Ironically, both my dad's names are Ron, so that confuses everybody. But my father, my biological father, Ron, there in the background on the left, would come up traditionally twice a year at Christmas time and in summer vacation. And I had no idea who he was. He was like this ghostly figure. He was super tall, and he would sort of sit and smoke and have a drink. I don't remember the sound of his voice. And so I called him Uncle Daddy, because everybody would tell me he was my dad, but we had a relationship kind of like an uncle that you would see a few times a year, so I called him Unca Daddy. And yeah, it took a while to navigate that relationship with him. We didn't have much time, because when I was 4, after a visit to see me at summer vacation, he died of a heart attack at the Toronto International Airport. And from that point on, my grandparents here on the left formally adopted me. So I spent the rest of my life, until 5 years ago, growing up in Canada. Then I went back a little bit further again. And so my grandmother, Madeline, here on the left, she left Belgium in 1952, pregnant with my uncle, and my mom and my sister were 2 and 1 years old, and just, picked up and moved to Canada to start a new life. She was one of the people most affected by our decision to move here. So I kind of found it ironic how much that affected her. She's still alive. She's 92, living in Canada. And then her mother, Flavia, that's pictured just at the start of World War II in France, where she was living at the time. She, too, got in a boat in the 1970s and emigrated to Canada. And even though I lost both my biological parents, I was so blessed when I think about it now. I've grown up with my parents or my grandparents and my great-grandparents all in the same household. And that was like weird to my school friends. That didn't happen anywhere else. And so I joked that I was the literal black sheep of my family, like my whole life. And first day at school, like when I was introducing my parents, and everybody would just stare at them and stare at me. But the thing that was constant was change. Like, long before HGTV, reality television, my grandparents here on the left were flipping houses. So in the 70s and the 80s, we'd buy a house, live there for 3 years, fix it all up, move on. So when this became a thing on television, my grandma was like, "Why were we never on television for that stuff?" Because that's just how we lived, and it was constant change. And so then I switched gears, started looking into my father's family that I don't know a lot about. I can't trace further back than my father's parents. So I was born in Bermuda, which everybody thinks is in the Caribbean. It's not. It's 300 miles east of South Carolina. It's kind of in the middle of nowhere, halfway between New York and England. And it's actually a chain of small islands. It's 22 little islands, and it was discovered in 1605. And because it was so small and uninhabitable, no one moved there for 100 years. But eventually it became a colony. And I did some digging. So the last name I was born with as a baby that I got from my black father is Paynter, Paynter. And I looked through ship manifests. And sometime in the 1800s, there's a woman named Mary who was white. They would list people's races when you got off the ship. And she had moved there from England to Bermuda, so I thought it was ironic that my name comes from all these places. But I was really interested in finding out more. So I did a DNA test and found out that it's much more complicated than black and white. And I was so excited. the little map here, it's maybe hard to see in the whole room. So all the areas in white are the places where I don't have DNA from. But everywhere else, all the colors. So I was like, I am a true citizen of the world, and that made me like so happy to know that there is all this ancestry from everywhere and everything. But traditionally, we're usually raised in one culture, maybe two, and we identify strongly as Italian American or Portuguese American or something American, something Canadian. So what if you found out this wasn't what you expected? I was happy about this, but what if you were not? And so I found this Twitter feed on Thanksgiving weekend where this woman's uncle on her Italian side found out he had no Italian DNA whatsoever. And the whole family was having a nervous breakdown, and it destroyed all their concepts of themselves.
Why did you do that?
So wait, I'll let you finish reading. She ended up changing the name on her Twitter account because she got so many followers and retweets, it was insane. So I think she tried to hide. And then to bring this into the now, this is a photograph of one of my daughters. We have two daughters who are now 18 and 21. One of them's here today. And so the one who can't be here today, of course, she made a decision at 19 to travel by herself to Australia and New Zealand and go backpacking with friends up and down the coast, and I almost had a nervous breakdown. I was like, what are you doing? You can't do this. But she saved up. She did it herself. She paid for it herself. And I thought, of course, in her first term away at school, she moved to New York City, clear across the other side of the country, and I cried every day for 3 weeks. But of course, this is her lineage. This is the tradition of leaving, of changing, and forging a path for yourself. And so one thing I wanted to share with you, to come back to the naming thing, and I'm so glad it ties in with what Jen was talking about as well. So I was born with the last name Painter. When I was adopted, I got the last name Dodds. And when I got married, I wholly embraced my husband's last name of Morgan, because I'm like, I'm choosing this. This is my choice, and I'm choosing this guy. And a lot of women don't do that these days for professional and other reasons that I totally support. But another little known fact is that I actually asked him to marry me, and I had a ring. So very, very untraditional proposal, but traditional that I took the last name, but then we eloped and didn't tell anyone and pissed everybody off. So that was kind of fun. And then how I kind of wrap all this up is I wanted to bring in a little bit about something I'm really passionate about as a yoga teacher and practitioner, and the notion of death, because we're not supposed to talk about death, or in very low tones. So I wrote a book about death called The End of Me. And what it's about is essentially I have physically died 3 times in my life, when I was 19, when I was 24, and when I was 28. And one of the things that I came back with, or that it's taught me, is about living your life is about embracing change and finding your own traditions, leaving behind the ones that don't serve you or your family anymore, not inviting toxicity to sit at your dinner table if that doesn't work for you, finding the traditions that work. And this time of year brings up all this turmoil for people about the shoulds, right? What you should do, where you should go, what you should buy, what you should eat. All these things come into play. And so this intensely personal story that I'm sharing with you is because I believe in the power and the tradition of storytelling. And here at Creative Mornings, this is something I've experienced every month for the last year. And I think by telling our stories, we give others permission to tell their stories too. And that's how we foster human connection. And that's how we make life worth living. And I think that's a tradition to keep going with. So thank you for letting me share my story today.
Thank you, Megan. Now you're done. Okay, we got